The original Resident Evil 4 has some of the best encounter and level design in the entire video game industry. There are so many memorable sequences in this game that remaking them would be no easy feat, but they did remake them. And while pretty much everybody can agree that the moment-to-moment combat has been vastly improved from the original to the remake, the level design is not so cut and dry. Iconic sections from the original have been reworked to accommodate for faster gameplay, and certain sections have been cut from the game entirely. So now the question arises, has the remake improved upon the encounter and level design, or does the original still remain the gold standard for Resident Evil games? Well, let's start with the village and work our way up from there. The village can be pretty much divided into two halves. There are the daytime sections and the nighttime sections. For the daytime sections, the remake follows the original's level design quite faithfully, with some minor differences here and there. At the same time, we get introduced to some new enemy types to mix up the encounters. It's not until the nighttime rolls around that we start to see some significant changes in the level design, starting with the redesign of the lake. In the original game, after you had beaten the lake monster, you could hop on the boat and take it across the lake to visit the merchant. The remake takes this idea and runs with it, giving you several locations the boat can travel to and multiple objectives that can be done in whatever order the player chooses. What was before a linear path that would loop you back the way you came has been expanded into a fully fleshed out area to explore. It's a welcome change in my opinion. I love it when things slow down in Resident Evil games because it gives you time to appreciate the atmosphere and have some downtime. So far, the remake's village is extremely impressive and only gives us more of what we loved from the 2005 game. However, the later sections of the village might be a different story. But first we need to talk about how the original handled things. After the Horde segment with Luis, you would get the choice of two paths. One has hordes of villagers to take down, and the other has a giant to take down. The remake completely does away with this idea and just sends you down the path of the villagers, which includes this duo chainsaw fight. But even this was handled better in the original. It begins with you taking care of a relatively small group of villagers, then things get real quiet and you start thinking, was that supposed to be the final defense of the village? Then you drop down and, oh shit, there are two chainsaws to deal with now. It elicits this fight or flight reaction from the player and feels like a setup that you would see from the old school PlayStation Resident Evil games. In the remake, when you come up on this part, Leon says out loud, "It's quiet."
Sure is quiet.
Which effectively deflates any and all tension that might have been there in the first place. This is actually part of a larger problem in modern Resident Evil games, where there's just too much in-game dialogue in general. This is especially distracting during boss fights, but that's a discussion for another day. All I want to know is, how is Sadler talking with that big-ass eyeball in his mouth? But let's get back on topic. What version of the village is better overall? Well, I think a compelling argument could be made for both. And while I do think the remake is superior in a lot of ways, I have to go with my gut here and give the win to the original village. It's just so perfect from start to finish, whereas I feel like the remake falls short in some areas. I mean, I guess it is hard to improve upon perfection, but the fact that they did improve the village in some areas is worth pointing out. Moving on to the castle, and this is where things start to get interesting because the two versions of the castle that we have here are very different, with a lot of notable sections from the original getting cut entirely. While it is disappointing to not see the lava room with the spike trap make a return, it is understandable to cut certain sections when you look at how the remake's castle has things set up. The entire castle is very interconnected and allows for a lot of optional backtracking. When some people hear the word backtracking, they think of boring and tedious busy work, but the backtracking in Resident Evil 4 is not like that at all. It is absolutely worth it to try and do all of the requests and find all of the treasures. Now let's look at the original castle, which by comparison feels extremely linear. Probably because it is extremely linear, which isn't a bad thing either, but it is very different from the remake's version. So with that in mind, I'm going to go ahead and make a statement that a lot of people might disagree with, but I believe every section that was adapted in the remake is superior to the original version. From the entrance hall, to the armory, to the library, the water hall, the hive, the mines, well, aside from the minecart section, which I think was a little bit more creative in the original. So when it comes down to what version of the castle is better, I think it really depends on personal preference. Do you prefer the linear room-to-room action that's constantly throwing new challenges at you? Or do you prefer taking things at your own pace and exploring every nook and cranny of a level? Personally, I fall into the latter camp, and I think that is more in the spirit of traditional Resident Evil, which means I'm going to give the win to the Remake's castle on this one. Oh boy, and now we get to the island, which has also had a lot of sections cut from the remake. However, this time I'm totally okay with the cuts they made, except for the U3 cut, which I'm totally not okay with. But this is a discussion about the level design and the encounters, not the bosses. The original island has been the subject of a lot of criticism over the years because of how heavily it leans into the over-the-top action and duck-and-cover combat mechanics. And yes, I know the duck-and-cover combat mechanics were influential back in the day, but this is 2023, Resident Evil has changed, I want more survival horror. At the same time, though, the island is where you fight the Regenerators, which are possibly the scariest monster designs in the entire Resident Evil franchise. Put these two things together and you get yourself a very inconsistent experience overall. I think the Remake's island fixes a lot of these issues. It feels like there's more time dedicated to the Regenerators, which is good, especially the incubation lab. I really loved that segment. So while the over-the-top action has been dialed back a little bit, it is certainly still here and is in full force. Which leads us to the helicopter section. I hate the helicopter section. This is a section I was never too fond of in the original game, and I might like it even less in the remake. Let's go over all the different enemy types we got here. We got guys with chain guns, guys with cattle prods, guys that are stationed on turrets, guys with rocket launchers. At one point, you have to operate a turret to take out an anti-air gun so your chopper could come in to lay down suppressing fire. Does any of this sound like a Resident Evil game? Because it sure as hell doesn't play like one. Oh, and if the chain guys, cattle prods, turrets, rocket launchers, and anti-air gun don't get you, don't worry, because one of the hundreds of crossbow guys will. Seriously, there is so many crossbow guys in this level. This type of duck and cover combat does not belong in the Resident Evil game, and there's a lot of reasons for why I think that, and I'm not going to get into it right here. Right about now, a lot of people may be getting the impression that I hate the island, but I don't. It's just one section that I'm not really too fond of. Like I said, everything with the Regenerators is fantastic, and the island is where the new stealth mechanics of the game really start to shine. That beginning area with the spotlight has such an MGS vibe to it, I love it. The only section that sticks out to me as being better in the original is the waste disposal section, mainly because in the remake you have to rely on Ashley to keep the bridge up. But don't worry, because Ashley assures us that she's pretty good at this stuff.
Leave it to me, I'm actually pretty good at this stuff.
I don't know how much skill is associated with turning valve handles, but I do know one thing: Ashley does not possess this skill. So overall, I think the island is a vast improvement over the original. At the end of the day, you could make an argument for the original or the remake. Both games are extremely strong, but personally, I really like what they did in the remake, and I think the level design is just a little more top-notch in the remake. Might be a little too early to say that, but that's what I'm going with. Anyway, thanks for watching. Have a good one.